Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to dive together into a story filled with tension, love, and unseen danger. A moment when exhaustion opens the door for darkness, and a family is pushed to the edge without even realizing it. From a hospital corridor filled with silence to the quiet fear that follows them home, every detail hides something deeper, something unsettling. As we explore this story, you'll discover that the greatest battles aren't always loud, and the biggest threats don't always show themselves right away. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Let's begin. The moment Jay collapsed from sheer exhaustion was the same moment the shadows finally began to move. The people pulling the strings had waited long enough. They chose the exact second when he was at his weakest. One tiny lapse, one brief distraction, and Maya was gone. Jess realized it far too late. His heart dropped into his stomach. Panic surged through him like ice water. He wanted to jump up, to run, to scream her name with whatever strength he had left, but his body refused to obey. His legs wouldn't move. His breathing turned shallow and broken, as if the air itself had betrayed him. He was trapped inside his own helplessness, and outside that hospital room, a carefully prepared plan was already unfolding, step by step. Would Ye arrive in time to protect Maya? And who was really behind everything happening? If you can feel the tightness in your chest right now, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with this story, because what comes next is the biggest twist yet. That night, the hospital felt endless. Cold white light stretched along the corridor, bathing everything in an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the chest. Inside the room, Yi lay still on the bed, eyes half open. He wasn't asleep anymore. Not really. The medication weighed on him like lead, pinning his body in place. Every breath took effort, but his mind, foggy as it was, remained painfully alert. The steady beeping of the heart monitor echoed in his ears. Beside him, Huyen sat leaning against the bed, her breathing slow and uneven, exhaustion etched into every line of her posture. Maya was curled up next to her mother, fast asleep. Her small hands clutched the edge of Yi's blanket, as if letting go might make him vanish again. The scene felt fragile, too fragile. Yi turned his head slightly, looking at the mother and child. A strange unease stirred inside him. It wasn't fear of his illness. It was something sharper, more instinctive. The danger wasn't over. And just then, it began. The door opened quietly. A nurse stepped inside, smiling gently. Little Maya needs to step out for a moment to get her milk, okay? Huyen nodded, too tired to stand right away. Maya obediently slid off the bed and looked at Ye one last time. Rest, Uncle Ye. I'll be right back. Ye wanted to respond, wanted to nod, but his throat was dry. His lips barely moved. No sound came out. All he could do was watch as Maya followed the nurse out of the room. And in that instant, a tight knot formed in his chest. Out in the hallway, Maya walked behind the nurse. As they turned a corner, someone called the nurse's name. She stopped for just a moment. And in that moment, an unfamiliar woman was already there. The woman crouched down until she was eye level with Maya. Her voice was soft, too soft. "You're Maya, aren't you?" Maya startled and stepped back, gripping her milk carton tightly. "Yes. Who are you?" The woman smiled. It was a perfect smile, polite, practiced, but her eyes were cold, scanning every movement the girl made. "I know, Uncle Jay. I just wanted to ask you something." She paused, then said lightly, "Would you like to see your dad?" Maya froze. She turned her head, looking for the nurse. Before she could move, the woman gently placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, but it made Maya's skin prickle. "Don't be scared," the woman said calmly. "I'll take you to him." Maya shook her head quickly, her heart pounding in her ears. Just then, the nurse returned. The woman immediately stepped back, withdrawing her hand as if she'd never touched Maya at all. Seconds later, she blended into the crowd and disappeared. Maya stood there, frozen. Her hands trembled. She didn't know why, but fear settled deep in her chest. Back in the room, Yi's eyes snapped open. A chill ran straight down his spine. The instincts of someone who had faced danger before were suddenly awake. He tried to lift his hand, but his body didn't respond. The IV line pulled tight as his heart began to race. "Maya!" He tried to call out, but only a faint breath escaped. He wanted to sit up, to run, to stand in front of his family like he always had. But this time, he couldn't. The helplessness hurt more than any fever ever had. Huyen realized something was wrong when Maya didn't come back. Her heart skipped, then began to pound. A cold sensation crept up her spine. She stood and moved quickly toward the door, her voice shaking. "Maya, where are you?" There was no answer. No small footsteps. No familiar voice calling back. Behind her, Ye stirred weakly. He forced his hand upward, his entire body aching. His eyes were wide with panic as his trembling finger pointed toward the door, toward the bright hallway beyond. Huyen turned instantly. "You're worried about Maya too?" she asked. Ye nodded, barely, but enough. Huyen's heart sank. She didn't wait another second. She ran into the hallway, with only one thought in her mind. Please, let her be safe. And then she saw her. Maya was standing at the nurse's station, clutching her milk carton, her face pale but unharmed. The moment Maya looked up and saw her mother, she ran straight into her arms. Huyen dropped to her knees and held her tightly, breathing hard like she'd just finished a race. Only when she felt Maya's heartbeat against her own did she finally exhale. "You scared me so much," Huyen whispered. "I'm sorry," Maya said softly. "I just went to get the milk." Huyen closed her eyes for just a second, but long enough to understand something terrifying. Someone was watching them. Evening came slowly. Dim light filtered through the hospital window, softening the sharp lines of Ye's pale face. He looked more aware now, though still weak. The doctor entered the room, his tone calm but direct. "You can be discharged today," he said, "but your condition is not mild." Huyen stood beside the bed, holding Maya's hand tightly. A heavy feeling settled in her chest. She had been exhausted for far longer than she wanted to admit. Not days, but months. Her body had warned her again and again. She had ignored it every time. The doctor lowered his voice. "If you keep overworking yourself and don't rest properly, you might not be so lucky next time." The words were short, but they made her tremble. "You need a long period of rest," he continued. "Not just a few days. You need to stop." Huyen nodded, her throat tight. Questions flooded her mind, questions she was afraid to ask. What will happen to this family? But she didn't say it. Instead, she took Ye's hand firmly. "This time," she said quietly, "you have to listen to the doctor. I don't need you to keep pushing. I just need you to stay." Ye looked at her. The eyes of a man used to carrying everything alone softened. For the first time, he didn't argue. Maya squeezed his hand and whispered, "Uncle Ye, rest. I'll stay with you." Ye closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He understood now. Beyond the hospital doors, another battle was already waiting. Silent, hidden, and far more dangerous. And this time, he couldn't face it alone. As evening settled in, the three of them finally returned home. The familiar door opened with a soft creak, and the quiet inside felt deeper than usual, almost sacred. The last traces of daylight spilled across the small courtyard where Maya's laughter used to echo. Tonight, everything moved more slowly, more carefully, as if the house itself knew Ye needed gentleness. Ye stepped inside with measured movements, each breath steady but deliberate. Huyen walked beside him, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't say much, but every pause, every small adjustment of her pace revealed her worry. Maya followed closely behind, clutching her little bag with both hands. Every few steps, she looked up at Ye, as if afraid he might disappear if she stopped watching. Ye sat down on the edge of the bed. The old frame creaked softly beneath him. He let out a long, slow breath. He was exhausted, but there was also a strange sense of familiarity. This bed had carried him through countless nights, nights filled with unspoken worries and silent endurance. Huyen placed the bag of medicine on the table and turned toward him. Her voice was calm but firm. "You heard what the doctor said. From now on, you rest. No heavy work, no pushing yourself, not even a little." She looked at him closely. There was no anger in her eyes, only fatigue mixed with guilt. Yi nodded slowly. "I know." Just 2 words, but for Huyen, they meant more than any promise he'd made before. She stepped closer and carefully adjusted the pillow behind his back, her movements gentle, almost hesitant. Then she paused. Her voice softened, trembling despite her effort to stay composed. "I never want to see you unconscious again. It terrified me." Ye reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, sincere. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm used to carrying everything by myself." Huyen squeezed his hand tighter. "But you're not alone anymore." That was when Maya finally climbed onto the bed, settling beside Ye and resting her head against his arm. "Uncle Ye," she said seriously, "you have to listen to the doctor." Ye smiled faintly. "Yes, if I don't, Maya won't let me." She nodded firmly, satisfied. Yi looked at Huyen again, his expression thoughtful. "And you," he added softly, "you need to rest too. I may be lying here, but I see everything. You're exhausted." Huyen froze for a moment. She hadn't expected him to notice, especially not now. Her throat tightened. "I'm fine," she whispered, then shook her head. "No, I need to learn how to rest too." Ye nodded gently. No more words were needed. Some things, after everything they'd been through, no longer needed explaining. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the windows. The last light of the sunset faded, giving way to night. But inside the small room, the atmosphere was different, lighter, warmer. It was the quiet that comes from understanding that simply being together is sometimes the greatest effort of all. That night, Yi didn't sleep alone. He rested within the fragile but sincere shelter of a family learning how to care for one another in a healthier way. Later, Ye leaned back against the pillow, the soft yellow lamplight falling across his still pale face. He wasn't asleep. He stared quietly at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. Sounds he had once feared he might never hear again. Maya sat beside him, her sketchbook carefully placed on the bed as if it were something precious. She lined up her colored pencils with solemn focus, choosing each one thoughtfully. Every now and then, She glanced up at Ye, just to make sure he was still there. "Uncle Ye," she asked softly, "can I draw you?" He turned his head and smiled faintly. "Sure, but Uncle's not very handsome, you know." Maya shook her head vigorously. "No, Uncle is a good person." Those simple words tightened Ye's chest. He didn't respond. He just gently stroked her hair and watched as she leaned over her drawing, completely absorbed. The pencil moved softly across the paper, making a quiet, comforting sound. Maya worked slowly, stopping now and then to tilt her head, thinking hard before continuing. Gradually, an imperfect figure took shape. Tall, slightly uneven, standing beside a little girl holding his hand. "This is you," Maya said, pointing proudly. "And this is me. If Uncle is here, I'm not scared anymore." Ye turned his face away for a moment, his throat closed. He had never realized that simply staying could mean so much. "Have you finished your homework?" he asked gently. "I did," Maya replied, pulling out her notebook. "But I want to stay here. Can I read to you?" "Yes," Ye said. Maya began reading, carefully sounding out each word. Her voice was small, uneven, but determined. When she stumbled, Ye corrected her softly. When she succeeded, she giggled under her breath. Time passed quietly, gently. Nothing else seemed to matter. In the kitchen, Huyen stood by the stove as a pot of medicine simmered. The bitter scent of herbs filled the air, strong, familiar, grounding. She stirred slowly, her movements precise. She was tired, deeply tired, but her hands didn't shake. Every dose mattered. She leaned against the counter for a moment, rubbing her forehead. The doctor's warning echoed again in her mind. If you keep overexerting yourself. Her gaze drifted toward the bedroom door. Through the narrow opening, she saw Maya sitting close to Ye, reading softly while he listened. It was an ordinary scene, almost mundane, and yet it loosened something in her chest. As long as it's like this, she thought. As long as he's here. The pot began to boil more strongly. Huyen snapped back to attention, lowered the heat, and poured the medicine into a bowl. The steam rose, stinging her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was the bitterness of the medicine or the emotions she'd been holding back. Back in the room, Maya looked up suddenly. "Uncle Ye, are you scared?" "Scared of what?" he asked. "Of going back to the hospital." Ye was quiet for a few seconds. Then he took her small hand in his. His voice was steady. "Yes, but what scares me more is not being able to be with you and your mom." Maya nodded and squeezed his hand tighter. Huyen stepped into the room with the bowl of medicine. She stopped for just a moment, watching their hands intertwined. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere, unseen, someone else was watching too. The story follows a fragile family pushed to the edge when exhaustion becomes the perfect opening for danger. As Ye collapses in the hospital, unseen forces begin to move, targeting the moment he can no longer protect those he loves. Maya's brief disappearance sends fear through the quiet corridors, revealing that someone is watching far more closely than anyone realizes. Though she is found safe, the incident leaves a chilling truth behind. This family is no longer invisible. After returning home, the tension softens into moments of warmth, care, and unspoken promises, as Ye is forced to rest and accept that he can't carry everything alone. Yet beneath the calm, shared meals, quiet drawings, gentle words, another threat lingers in the shadows. Just when it seems like peace has returned, the question remains, who is observing them, and what will happen when they make their next move?